The silent battlefield. The sky above the ruined colony was filled with smoke, fire, and the wreckage of shattered ships. Once, this place had been alive with trade and hope. But now it stood broken, its people scattered, its defenses torn apart. At the heart of the colony, a group of human survivors hid inside the burned-out remains of a command tower. The walls trembled with every distant blast. The ground shook as enemy machines patrolled the streets outside. They were surrounded. Inside the tower, a young officer named David pressed his back to the wall. His face was pale, his uniform torn, but his eyes held fire. Around him, a dozen men and women sat in silence, their bodies bruised, their weapons almost empty. Their supplies were gone, and their hope was close to fading. "They won't let us live," whispered one of the wounded. "They'll drag us out. You've seen what they do to prisoners." David clenched his fists, his jaw tight. He knew the enemy. They were ruthless, cold, and merciless. They believed humanity was weak, a species of emotion and fear. They had already destroyed 3 colonies before this one. Now they hunted the last survivors like animals. Still, David would not let despair win. "As long as we breathe," he said quietly, "we fight." Outside, the enemy's voices echoed, metallic and sharp, their machines moving closer. The survivors heard the scrape of claws on the streets, the thud of armored legs, the hiss of strange engines. They were being hunted step by step. Hours passed. Every shadow felt like a threat. The survivors whispered among themselves, their words heavy with fear. "What if no help comes?" asked a girl barely out of her teens. Her hands shook as she held her small weapon. "What if this is the end?" David wanted to give her comfort, but the truth was bitter. The human fleet had been scattered. No signal had reached them. No rescue had arrived. For all he knew, they had been forgotten. Abandoned. Yet, in his heart, something burned stronger than fear. He remembered Earth's old lessons, the stories of how humanity never gave up even in the darkest hours. He remembered his father's words, "Humans bend, but they do not break." Suddenly, the walls trembled harder. The enemy had found their hiding place. A terrible roar shook the ground as heavy machines surrounded the tower. Bright lights cut through the smoke, flooding the broken windows. Shadows of enemy soldiers crawled across the walls. "They're here," someone whispered in terror. The survivors raised their weapons, weak but defiant. They knew this was it, the final stand. David felt his chest tighten. He thought of home, of blue skies and laughter, of things they might never see again. The enemy commander's voice boomed outside, harsh and mocking. "Humans," it said in broken words, "your time ends now. Surrender, and perhaps your end will be quick." Silence followed. The survivors exchanged looks. Some wanted to run. Others wanted to scream. But David stepped forward, his voice firm though his hands shook. "Humanity does not surrender," he shouted back. Laughter echoed outside, cruel and cold. The enemy began to charge their weapons. The survivors gripped their rifles, ready for the hopeless fight. And then, in that moment, the sky above them changed. A low hum filled the air. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried by the wind, but it grew louder, deeper, until it shook the very ground. The enemy paused, their machines turning their heads to the heavens. Through the smoke, a massive shadow fell across the colony. Something vast and powerful tore through the clouds. David lifted his eyes, his breath caught in his throat. It was a warship, a human warship. The survivors gasped, their despair breaking into disbelief. The ship's hull glowed with power, its engines burning like suns. Across its side were the marks of Earth, the symbol of home, the promise of vengeance. The enemy froze. Even they knew what it meant. The silence shattered as the warship roared to life, its cannons igniting the night with fire brighter than lightning. The sound was thunder itself, echoing across the ruins. The survivors covered their ears, tears filling their eyes, because in that sound was salvation. They had been abandoned and surrounded. But now, humanity had returned. The roar of salvation, Warship cut through the clouds like a blade of light, its engines blazing and its weapons glowing with deadly promise. The survivors in the tower stared in disbelief, their eyes wide, their hearts pounding. For hours they had waited for death. Now hope had returned from the stars. David pressed his hand against the broken wall and whispered, "They came back." His voice trembled, not with fear, but with awe. Around him the others began to rise, their bodies no longer heavy with despair. Outside, the enemy soldiers froze. Their machines, once so certain and merciless, turned their weapons upward. They had mocked humanity as weak, but they had not expected this. Not a single human fighter. An entire warship, massive, proud, alive with fire. The sky erupted. Beams of burning energy rained down, striking the enemy positions. The ground shook like an earthquake. Towers of flame burst through the streets. Enemy machines that had once walked with confidence were torn apart, their metal bodies flung across. The rubble. The survivors shielded their eyes as the night turned into day. The roar of the warship's cannons was deafening, each shot a promise that humanity was not finished. David felt tears sting his eyes. Not of sadness, but of pride. Humanity had been beaten, abandoned, forgotten. Or so it seemed. But no. They had not been abandoned. Somewhere out there someone had heard their call. Somewhere someone still believed in them. "Look," one of the survivors cried, pointing upward. From the belly of the warship, smaller ships broke free, swift and sharp like hawks unleashed from the hand of a hunter. They streaked down toward the colony, their wings cutting through the smoke, their weapons already firing. The enemy scattered. Their roars of triumph turned to screams of confusion. Their claws scrambled against the streets as the first human strike craft dove, releasing a storm of fire and missiles. Explosions ripped through the enemy ranks. The hunters had become the hunted. Inside the tower, the survivors could hardly breathe. The sound of gunfire outside had changed. Now it carried a rhythm they knew, a rhythm that gave strength. It was the sound of human weapons. It was the sound of their people fighting back. But the battle was far from over. Through the smoke, the enemy commander rose, a massive figure wrapped in armor and power. Its voice boomed over the chaos, calling its warriors to stand firm. It raised its weapon, pointing it toward the warship. Suddenly, the sky cracked with energy as the enemy launched their own counterattack. From hidden platforms around the colony, great cannons emerged, spitting beams of burning light upward. They slammed into the human warship, shaking its shields. The survivors gasped. The warship staggered under the fire, its hull glowing red where the blasts struck. For a moment it seemed like even this savior could fall. David's heart clenched. He pressed his fist against his chest. "Hold the line," he whispered, as if the ship could hear him. The warship answered. With a thunderous blast, it turned, its main cannon on the largest enemy weapon. A single shot, brighter than the sun, tore across the battlefield. The ground split apart. The enemy cannon vanished in a storm of fire and metal. The survivors cheered, their voices breaking through fear. Even those too weak to stand raised their fists. But the enemy did not stop. They swarmed toward the tower, furious, desperate to crush the last humans before the warship could finish them. Their machines leapt across rubble, their claws tearing through steel. David turned back to his people. "We fight now," he said, his voice sharp. "We hold until they reach us." The survivors gripped their weapons, their eyes no longer filled with despair. They had been surrounded before, but now the roar of the warship thundered above them. They were not fighting alone. The enemy burst through the shattered gates. Gunfire lit the darkness. Humans shouted, weapons cracked, metal screamed. Every corner of the ruined tower turned into a battleground. Outside, the warship's smaller craft descended closer, carving paths through the enemy with relentless fire. Through the smoke and chaos, David caught sight of the impossible. A squad of armored human soldiers leaping from the skies, their drop pods slamming into the ground like meteors. They emerged with heavy rifles, their armor glowing, their movements fast and merciless. "Reinforcements," David breathed. His chest swelled. For the first time in days, He believed they would live. The human soldiers advanced, carving through the enemy ranks with precise fire. Step by step, they pushed toward the tower. The survivors roared, their voices joining the storm. The colony was still in ruins. The enemy still outnumbered them. But the balance had changed. Humanity's warship had returned, and with it, a truth that no enemy could erase. Humans bend, but they do not break. The price of defiance. The colony burned with two kinds of fire. One was the enemy's rage, hot and merciless. The other was humanity's defiance, roaring from the sky. The clash of both lit the night like a storm of suns. David's hands were raw from firing his rifle, his throat hoarse from shouting orders. But he did not stop. Around him, survivors fought side by side, shoulder to shoulder, refusing to give an inch. Every shot they fired was fueled not only by fear, but by the roar of the warship above them. The enemy pushed hard. Their machines tore through the outer walls, claws screeching, weapons blazing. For every enemy soldier that fell, two more appeared from the smoke. Their commander, towering and armored, drove them forward with thunderous bellows. Inside the tower, the walls shook with each impact. Stones cracked, beams groaned, dust rained down from the ceiling. The survivors were breaking under the weight of the assault, but their spirits burned brighter than their bodies could endure. "Hold the door," David cried, pulling two wounded men back as another wave of enemy machines slammed against the barricade. Gunfire flared, metal screamed, and the barricade shattered. The survivors staggered, but at that exact moment the sky opened again. Drop-ships screamed downward, releasing more human soldiers in heavy armor. They struck the ground like thunder, their rifles blazing with controlled bursts of fire. Energy, shields flared around them, absorbing blasts that would have killed ordinary men. They fought like warriors from legend, unshaken and unbroken. The survivors cheered, but David noticed something in their movements. The human soldiers fought with precision, but their formation was thin, too thin. Then he saw it. On their shoulders, painted in dark marks, were the scars of battle. These were not fresh troops. They were tired, bloodied, carrying wounds hidden under armor. The warship had not arrived with endless power. It had arrived carrying warriors already stretched to their limits. The realization cut through his joy. Humanity had not come back with overwhelming strength. Humanity had come back because it refused to leave anyone behind, no matter the cost. The warship roared again, its cannons slamming into enemy positions, but the fire pouring back at it grew heavier. More hidden enemy cannons unfolded from the rubble, spitting beams of destruction. The warship's shields flickered. Its hull glowed. Each strike left black scars across its shining surface. One survivor cried out in fear. "They'll bring it down. The ship will fall." David clenched his jaw. He would not let fear rule. He raised his weapon and shouted, "Then we fight harder." His words sparked the others. The survivors surged forward, firing with renewed strength, side by side with the armored soldiers. Their small rifles looked weak compared to the enemy's machines, but each shot carried defiance, and that defiance spread like fire. The enemy commander roared again, its voice shaking the ground. It leapt onto the rubble of a shattered wall, lifting a massive weapon that glowed with sickly green light. Its aim locked on the human warship above. David's blood ran cold. He knew what was about to happen. The commander fired. A beam of burning energy streaked into the sky, striking the warship's underbelly. The explosion was blinding. The ship staggered, flames crawling along its hull. For a terrible moment, it seemed as though it would fall. The survivors screamed in horror. Even the armored soldiers froze for a heartbeat. The warship tilted, fire pouring from its side, its engines flickering. But then, through the chaos, it stabilized. The engines roared louder, brighter, as if the ship itself refused to fall. Its cannons blazed again, answering the commander's attack with devastating fire that tore through an entire block of enemy forces. The survivors erupted in cheers, their hope reignited. David fell to his knees for a moment, overwhelmed by the sight. The warship was bleeding, but it stood. Humanity was bleeding, but it fought. Yet the battle was far from won. The enemy, enraged, swarmed even harder. The survivors' ammunition ran low. Every shot had to count. David's rifle clicked empty, and he grabbed a weapon from the hands of a fallen enemy, firing until his arms ached. One of the armored soldiers landed beside him, covering his flank. The soldier's voice came through a helmet speaker, calm but strained. "Hold on. The warship cannot hold forever. We need to break the commander's line." David nodded, though fear gripped him. Breaking the line meant going out there, into the heart of the enemy swarm, toward the towering figure that had nearly destroyed their savior. He looked at his people, bruised and battered but still standing. He looked at the burning warship, above, still fighting despite the wounds carved into its hull. And he made his choice. "We go," David said, his voice firm. "We end this." The survivors exchanged looks of fear and determination. Slowly, one by one, they nodded. They had been abandoned. They had been surrounded. But now they carried the roar of the warship inside them. They would not wait for rescue. They would carve their own **, the last charge. The streets of the colony were broken rivers of rubble and fire. Smoke curled upward, lit by flashes of gunfire and the thunder of explosions. Above, the warship groaned under enemy fire, its engines roaring, its shields flickering like fading stars. David led the survivors out of the shattered tower, their steps heavy but steady. Around them, armored soldiers from the warship joined ranks, moving like iron giants. Together they formed a small force pushing into the heart of the enemy swarm. The enemy commander loomed in the distance, its massive frame lit by the green glow of its weapon. Every time it raised the weapon, fire streaked toward the warship. Every time the warship answered with its own burning cannon. The sky became a battlefield of its own, one strike against another. But the warship was wounded, and time was against them. "We have to bring it down," David said, his voice raw. His rifle trembled in his hands, not from fear but from exhaustion. He looked at the commander and felt the weight of every life depending on this moment. The armored soldier beside him nodded. If the commander falls, their army breaks. But it will not fall easy. The survivors tightened their grip on their weapons. Some whispered prayers. Others pressed their teeth together in silence. Every one of them knew the truth. This charge could be their end. David raised his rifle high. "Then we make it fall." They moved. The human warship above seemed to sense their defiance. Its cannons roared, tearing open paths through the enemy ranks. Beams of light fell like spears, smashing machines into fragments, throwing armored beasts into the air. The ground trembled as rubble and fire cleared, just enough for the survivors and soldiers to advance. They ran. Their boots pounded against broken stone, their breath sharp, their weapons blazing. The enemy surged to meet them, roaring with fury, claws outstretched. The first clash was brutal. Metal slammed against metal, rifles cracked, screams filled the air. David fired until his rifle overheated, then swung it like a club, smashing it into an enemy's skull. A survivor beside him fell, but another took their place, screaming defiance. The armored soldiers fought like a storm, their rifles cutting down enemy after enemy, their shields glowing as claws and blades struck. But even they were strained. For every enemy that fell, more surged forward, their commander driving them into the fight. David forced his way through the chaos, his eyes locked on the towering figure ahead. The commander stood above all, unmoved by the destruction around it, its weapon charging again with burning green light. "Fire on the commander!" the armored soldier shouted. Beams and bullets streaked toward the massive figure, but the commander raised a shield of energy, deflecting the storm. The shots cracked against it, sparks flying, but the barrier held. The survivors faltered. "We can't break it," one of them cried. David's chest heaved. He saw the warship above, its cannons slowing, its shields breaking. He saw the faces of his people, bloodied but unbroken, and he remembered the stories, the old tales of humans who stood against impossible odds, not because they were strong, but because they refused to kneel. He raised his voice, shouting over the thunder. "We are human. We bend, but we do not break. Keep firing." His words spread like fire. The survivors roared, raising their weapons again. Bullets, beams, and fire slammed into the commander's shield. The armored soldiers stepped forward, adding their full power. The barrier trembled, sparks flying across its surface. The commander roared in fury, pressing its weapon higher. The glow grew blinding. It was preparing to unleash another shot at the warship. Then, with a sound like shattering glass, the shield cracked. "Now!" David screamed. All at once, every human weapon fired. The air burned with the storm of bullets and beams. The commander staggered, its armor breaking under the onslaught. The green glow faltered, sparks bursting from its weapon. David charged. He grabbed a fallen enemy's blade, its edge glowing red with heat, and sprinted through the storm. The commander turned its gaze on him, towering, furious. David leapt, every muscle screaming, and drove the blade into the cracks of its armor. The commander roared, swinging its massive hand, striking him down. Pain tore through his body as he hit the ground. But the damage was done. The weapon in the commander's hand overloaded, sparks flying, light bursting. The massive figure stumbled, its roar turning into a scream. The weapon exploded in a wave of fire, throwing the commander to its knees. The survivors cried out in triumph. The armored soldiers surged forward, finishing the attack, their rifles blazing into the broken giant. The commander fell. The ground shook as its body collapsed, its armor cracking, its roar fading into silence. All across the battlefield, the enemy froze. Their voices faltered. Their machines stopped. The fall of their leader broke the storm. Above, the warship roared. Again, its cannons unleashing one last strike that tore through the remaining enemy forces. The battle turned. The survivors looked around, their bodies shaking, their weapons heavy. For the first time since the nightmare began, they saw the enemy retreat. David struggled to his feet, blood on his face, his chest burning with pain. He looked up at the warship, its engine still blazing despite the scars across its hull. He whispered through broken breath, "We are not abandoned. We are not broken." The dawn after fire. The battlefield lay silent, broken under smoke and ash. Fires still burned in shattered streets, and the night sky glowed faintly red from the ruins of battle. The enemy was gone, scattered like shadows before the sun. Only the wounded and weary humans remained, their breaths heavy, their eyes wide. With disbelief, David stood among them, swaying on his feet. His uniform was torn. Blood marked his face, but his eyes were alive. Around him, the survivors lifted their heads, slowly realizing that the endless nightmare had ended. They were still here. Above them, the warship loomed like a wounded guardian. Its hull bore scars, deep black lines where enemy fire had struck. Fires still glimmered on its surface and smoke trailed from its side. Yet it did not fall. It stood against the stars, a silent promise that humanity would always rise again. The armored soldiers moved through the streets, checking for survivors and helping the wounded. Their armor was scratched and burned, their movements tired but steady. One soldier approached David, removing their helmet. Their face was pale, marked by exhaustion, but their voice was calm. "The commander is dead. The enemy has lost their will to fight. We've secured the colony." David let out a long breath, his chest aching with both pain and relief. He turned to his people. Men and women who had expected to die only hours ago now stood with their weapons lowered, their bodies trembling with the shock of survival. Tears ran down faces, some from grief, some from joy. One of the youngest survivors whispered, "We lived. We actually lived." Her words spread among them, fragile but powerful. For the first time in days, smiles broke through the despair. People embraced one another, clutching hands, holding on to the simple truth. They were alive. The warship above lowered its dropships again, this time not for battle, but for rescue. Medics and engineers poured into the ruins, carrying supplies, treating wounds, guiding survivors toward safety. Where once there had been only fear and fire, now there was movement, care, and hope. David helped lift one of the wounded onto a stretcher. His arms shook from exhaustion, but he forced himself to keep moving. He had made a promise, to fight until the end. Now he would keep moving until his people were safe. When the last survivor was carried aboard the warship, David lingered on the ground. He turned his gaze across the ruined colony, remembering every face lost, every cry of despair, every moment when hope seemed gone. He bowed his head, honoring them in silence. The armored soldier placed a hand on his shoulder. They fought well. They endured. That is what it means to be human. David nodded, his throat tight. We bend, but we do not break, he whispered. As the warship prepared to depart, its engines roared once more, lifting it higher into the sky. From its hangars, light spilled out, guiding the survivors into safety. The colony itself was broken, but the people were not. Humanity had saved them. Not with overwhelming numbers, not with perfect strength, but with the fire of never giving up. From the observation deck of the warship, David looked down at the colony one last time. Smoke still curled upward. But in the distance beyond the fires, the first light of dawn began to rise. The sky shifted from red to gold, the shadows fading. The survivors gathered beside him, their faces bathed in the soft light of morning. Some wept quietly. Others simply stared, unable to believe they would see another sunrise. David turned to them, his voice steady, though his body was weak. We were abandoned. We were surrounded. But humanity came back. And now, we will rebuild. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of every moment they had endured. The survivors stood straighter, their chests lifting, their eyes no longer filled with despair. The warship soared higher, breaking through the clouds, carrying with it the wounded, the tired, and the unbroken. Its roar was no longer the sound of war, but the sound of survival, the sound of a species that refused to die. And as the dawn spread across the sky, one truth remained clear: humanity bends, but it does not break.